The scream sliced through the grocery store like a fire alarm. It wasn't just loud, it was sharp, panicked, offended in the way only someone who has just lost control can sound. Conversations died mid-sentence. A shopping cart somewhere down the aisle screeched to a halt. Even the deli slicer stopped humming for a second, heads turned, necks craned. And there she stood, frozen in disbelief, staring straight at me as if I'd just committed a personal crime against her existence. Meanwhile, I stood there completely calm, my heart finally steady, the warmth of a paper bag pressed into my palms. The smell of freshly fried potato wedges rising like the quiet aftermath of a storm. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to, because in that moment, she understood something she clearly had never learned before. The world does not rearrange itself just because you demand it to. But this didn't start with yelling. It didn't start with confrontation, and it definitely didn't start with revenge. It started the way so many of the most satisfying justice stories do, with something painfully ordinary. A normal day, a harmless errand, the kind of moment where you expect nothing memorable to happen at all. If you've ever stood quietly in a line, following the rules, waiting your turn, while someone else acted like patience was beneath them. If you've ever felt that familiar knot of irritation when entitlement walks in uninvited, then stay with me, because this story isn't about anger, it's about restraint, and what happens when someone mistakes your silence for weakness. Before we go any further, though, let me ask you something. If you've ever fantasized, even just a little, about perfectly timed, rule-abiding revenge, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories where karma doesn't rush, but it always arrives. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and trust me, by the end of this one, you'll be glad you stayed. Now let me take you back. It was supposed to be a 5-minute stop. That's it. In and out. Done. My wife had asked me earlier that day if I could grab some potato wedges from the grocery store deli on my way home. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just comfort food, the kind of small request you don't think twice about. I remember pulling into the parking lot already planning the rest of my evening, thinking about dinner, about getting home, about absolutely nothing related to conflict or confrontation. Inside, the store felt calm, too calm, honestly. Bright fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors. The low murmur of people moving through aisles blended with the distant beeping of registers. The deli section smelled like hot oil, salt, and seasoning, familiar, comforting. I walked up and saw the line. Short, manageable, maybe 4 or 5 people at most. No big deal. I stepped to the back of it without hesitation, pulled out my phone, and waited. That's when she appeared. She didn't approach the line the way everyone else did. There was no pause. No scanning for who was last, no polite question. She walked straight up to the counter and stopped close enough that it immediately felt wrong, invasive, like she'd skipped an invisible step everyone else instinctively knew existed. Beside her stood a younger girl, maybe her daughter, maybe her granddaughter, quiet, shoulders slightly hunched. Eyes already tired in that way that tells you she's seen this behavior before and knows exactly how it usually ends. At first, I assume confusion. Maybe she didn't see the line. Maybe she thought it started somewhere else. It happens. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, because that's what decent people do. The first customer finished their order, thanked the deli worker, and stepped away. Instantly, the woman moved forward. The deli worker smiled politely, the kind of smile worn thin by years of public service, and said, "Ma'am, there's a line. I'll help you as soon as it's your turn." She sighed loudly and stepped back, not into the line, just off to the side. That should have been my first clue. The second customer was served. Again, she stepped forward, almost reflexively, as if gravity itself was pulling her toward the counter. Again, she was stopped. Same words, same calm tone. This time, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her arms crossed. Her foot began tapping against the tile. By the third customer, the atmosphere had shifted. You could feel it. That subtle tightening in the air when someone's patience has expired but their entitlement hasn't. She leaned toward the girl beside her and muttered, just loud enough for several of us to hear, This is fucking ridiculous. I just want some wedges. It wasn't what she said that made my stomach drop. It was how she said it, not frustrated, not tired, offended, as if the mere existence of a line was a personal insult. As if the rest of us were inconveniences rather than people. I felt that familiar heat rise in my chest. The kind that comes from witnessing disrespect you didn't ask for but are forced to absorb anyway. I stayed where I was. I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my problem. But part of me was already alert, already bracing, because I could sense what was coming next. The man ahead of me finished his order. He stepped aside, and right on cue, she moved again, this time directly in front of me. No hesitation. No acknowledgement. Just a confident step forward, like she fully expected no one to challenge her. For a split second, I considered letting it go, letting her have her way, taking the easy route. But something about the way she did it, the certainty, the assumption, snapped something into focus inside me. Actually, I said, my voice calm but clear, the end of the line is behind me. She whipped around so fast her hair swung across her face, her eyes locked onto mine. Wide with disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend that someone had spoken up. This is bullshit, she snapped. It's first come, first serve. The irony hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The deli worker stopped moving. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, holding her gaze. After a long, uncomfortable pause, she scoffed dramatically and stomped back to her spot off to the side, muttering under her breath. It was my turn now. The deli worker asked what I wanted. And I glanced through the glass at the tray of potato wedges. There were only a few left, not nearly enough for what I'd planned to bring home. I told him I'd need more than what was available. He nodded and explained they'd have to drop a fresh batch. About a 5-minute wait, maybe longer, and that's when an idea, quiet, patient, perfectly legal, began to form. I told him he could help her while we waited. Her head snapped up instantly. Finally. Her moment, she stepped forward, ordered wedges, and was told the exact same thing, fresh batch needed. She rolled her eyes, sighed dramatically, and said, fine. Might as well at this point. She stepped aside again, arms crossed, jaw clenched, waiting. She had no idea that by choosing to wait, she had just handed me the perfect opportunity. And she definitely had no idea that in just a few minutes, she'd be screaming that same question. He did what? Loud enough for the entire store to hear, but that part, that delicious part, that comes next. Waiting can do strange things to people. For some, it's a minor inconvenience. For others, it feels like an attack on their identity. As I stood there, leaning slightly against the counter, I could feel the difference between the two types of people unfolding right in front of me. On one side, there was me, calm on the surface, quietly observant, already emotionally tired but still composed. On the other side, there was her, vibrating with irritation, every second of waiting fueling her belief that she was being wronged simply by not being prioritized. The deli worker disappeared into the back to start the next batch of potato wedges, and the hum of the fryer filled the silence he left behind. Oil popping, metal clinking, the smell growing stronger by the second. It was the kind of sound and scent that usually makes people hungry, relaxed, patient, but not her. She paced. Not enough to look completely unhinged, just enough to be noticeable. A few steps forward, a few steps back. Her arms uncrossed, then crossed again. She kept glancing at the fryer like she could somehow will it to move faster through sheer entitlement alone. The girl with her stayed quiet. She stared at the floor, then at the nearby refrigerated case, anywhere except at the woman beside her. Every now and then, she would shift her weight or adjust her jacket, small movements that screamed discomfort. I wondered how many times she'd stood next to this woman in public places like this. How many times she'd learned to brace herself for moments exactly like this one. That thought sat heavy in my chest, because when someone grows up around this kind of behavior, they don't just learn impatience, they learn shame. As the minutes stretched on, I noticed something else. The woman wasn't just angry. She was performing her anger, loud sighs, eye rolls, exaggerated glances toward the counter. She wanted an audience. She wanted validation. She wanted someone, anyone, To acknowledge that she believed she was being treated unfairly, and when no one gave her that satisfaction, her irritation sharpened. She muttered under her breath again. Not quite loud enough to confront, but loud enough to be heard. Complaints about wasting time, about how this shouldn't take so long, about how she was here first anyway. Each comment landed like a small spark, testing to see if it would ignite something. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't react. I could feel her frustration intensifying with every second she failed to provoke a response. Inside, though, my thoughts were racing. Not angry thoughts, calculating ones. I replayed everything that had happened so far. Every time she tried to cut. Every time she ignored the rules. Every time she acted like the rest of us didn't exist. And the more I thought about it, the clearer something became. This wasn't about potato wedges. It never had been. This was about power, about her belief that rules were for other people, about her expectation that patience was optional as long as she complained loudly enough. The fryer timer beeped softly in the back. Not ready yet. Just a reminder that time was passing slowly. Deliberately, fairly, the deli worker reappeared, briefly checked on the batch, and disappeared again. The woman groaned as if personally betrayed by the lulls of cooking. She leaned toward the counter, resting her elbows against the glass, invading the worker's space even though he wasn't there. Her fingers drummed impatiently against the surface. I stood still. I didn't shift. I didn't check my phone again. I wanted her to see that I was comfortable waiting, that I wasn't bothered, that whatever game she thought she was playing, I wasn't participating. And I could tell that bothered her more than anything else. She glanced at me out of the corner of her eye, just a quick look, assessing, measuring. I knew that look. It's the look someone gives when they're trying to decide whether you're an obstacle or a doormat. I met her gaze calmly when she looked again, my expression neutral, unreadable. No challenge, no submission, just presence. The silence stretched. Another minute passed, then another. The fryer beeped again, louder this time. Almost ready. The smell intensified, rich and salty, filling the air. I saw her straighten, anticipation flashing across her face. Her body shifted forward, subtly angling itself closer to the counter. She was preparing, planning, like a runner ready to sprint the moment the starting gun fired. That's when I realized something important. She wasn't planning to wait her turn, even now. Even after everything, she fully intended to jump ahead the second the wedges came out, as if nothing that had happened before mattered at all, as if the line was just a suggestion she could ignore whenever it suited her. And strangely enough, instead of making me angry, that realization made me calm, focused, because once you understand someone's pattern, they become predictable. And predictability is power. The deli worker returned, this time carrying the tray. Fresh, full, golden, steam rising gently from the pile of perfectly cooked wedges. The sound of them settling into the display tray was soft, almost ceremonial. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. I felt it before it happened, the shift in her posture, the forward lean, the inhale like she was about to speak. She stepped, just a half step. Testing. Pushing the boundary. I moved slightly too. Not aggressively, not abruptly, just enough to clearly establish my place. And in that tiny moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, then irritation, then something darker. She hadn't expected resistance, not again. The deli worker looked up at me. "How much would you like?" he asked. And in that second, with the tray full, her attention locked, her patience completely gone, I realized I had a choice. I could order what I came for. I could be reasonable. I could walk away and let her finally get what she wanted. Or I could teach her a lesson she would never forget. And as the words formed in my mind, slow and deliberate, I already knew which choice I was going to make. Because some people don't learn through explanations, they only learn through consequences. And hers were about to arrive, piping hot. The deli worker's question hung in the air longer than it should have. "How much would you like?" he asked again, his tone neutral, professional, completely unaware that this was no longer a simple transaction. Time felt strange in that moment. Everything slowed down. Like the world was holding its breath. I could hear the faint crackle of The fryer cooling behind the counter, the rustle of a paper bag somewhere to my left, the distant echo of a child laughing in another aisle. And beneath all of it, I could feel her presence beside me, tense, coiled, waiting to pounce the second she thought she could get away with it. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because I was thinking, really thinking, about every moment that had led up to this one. About how many times she had tried to skip the line. About the way she spoke. About waiting as if it were beneath her. About the way she looked at everyone else like obstacles instead of people. And about that girl standing next to her, shrinking into herself, already bracing for the embarrassment she knew was inevitable. This wasn't anger driving me anymore. It was clarity. I glanced at the tray again. It was full now, completely full. A generous batch of golden wedges, perfectly cooked, steam still curling upward, salt glistening on their surface. More than enough for multiple people. More than enough for both of us. And yet, something in me knew that giving her what she wanted, even partially, would only reinforce everything she believed about the world. That if you push hard enough, if you complain loud enough, if you refuse to respect boundaries, eventually someone will give in just to make you go away. I wasn't willing to be that someone. I felt her shift closer, not enough for the worker to notice, but enough that I could feel the heat of her impatience at my side. Her foot tapped once, twice. She cleared her throat loudly, a not so subtle reminder that she was there, waiting, watching. It was almost impressive how confident she was that she would still get her way, even now. Even after everything. The deli worker looked at me expectantly, scoop in hand. And that's when I made my decision. I'll take all of them, I said quietly. The words didn't come out sharp or smug. They came out calm, controlled, almost gentle. For a split second, I wondered if he'd misheard me, because his eyebrows lifted slightly and he paused, scoop hovering over the tray. All of them, he asked, glancing from me to the wedges and back again. Yes, I said, meeting his eyes. All of them. Something subtle changed in his expression. Not shock, not confusion. Recognition. The kind that comes when someone who deals with the public every day realizes exactly what's happening and why. The corner of his mouth twitched, just slightly, before he nodded. Sure thing, he said. Behind me, I felt it before I heard it, the sharp intake of breath, the sudden stillness. Her body locking up as the meaning of my words finally reached her. The deli worker began scooping. Metal against metal, the sound oddly satisfying as wedge after wedge disappeared into the paper-lined container. Each scoop felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the inevitable explosion. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. I could feel her staring at the container as if sheer disbelief might somehow change the outcome. I imagined what was going through her mind, the rapid recalculation, the disbelief. The quiet panic of realizing that the rules she'd been trying to bulldoze through were now working perfectly against her. The container filled, then another. The worker sealed them carefully, efficiently, like this was the most normal thing in the world. To him, maybe it was. To her, it was unthinkable. As he handed me the bags, I thanked him, sincerely. Because he hadn't just done his job, he'd upheld fairness without needing to say a single extra word. I took the bags, feeling their weight settle into my hands, the warmth seeping through the paper. And then I did something very deliberate. I didn't rush. I turned slowly, calmly. I stepped away from the counter at an unhurried pace, just slow enough to let reality sink in. Just slow enough to give her time to understand that this wasn't a mistake. That this wasn't temporary, that there were no extra wedges coming just for her, that her weight, all that impatience, all that entitlement, had led to exactly this outcome. I could hear her breathing change behind me, faster, sharper. The sound of someone trying to process an outcome they never imagined was possible. I took another step, then another. The space between us widened, but the tension didn't fade. If anything, it grew heavier. And then it happened. He did what? The words burst out of her like a siren, loud, high-pitched, raw with disbelief. Every head in the deli area snapped toward her. Conversation stopped. A cashier leaned out from behind a register to see what was happening. The girl beside her flinched, her face flushing red as she stared at the floor. I stopped walking. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I turned just enough to look back at her, not with triumph, not with mockery, just a steady, calm look, the kind that doesn't challenge, it confirms. Her mouth was open, her eyes wide, her entire body rigid with the realization that she had lost. Not because someone cheated, not because someone was rude, but because someone had followed the rules better than she ever could. For a moment, she looked like she might say something else. Like she might argue, demand, complain. But there was nothing left to say. The wedges were gone. The line had moved on. The world had not bent to her will. I turned away again and continued toward the exit. The sound of her outrage fading behind me with every step. The door slid open, cool air brushing against my face, and as I stepped outside, I felt something unexpected wash over me. Not guilt. Relief. Not because I'd won, but because for once, someone like her hadn't. Because for once, patience had been rewarded, and entitlement had been denied. And because somewhere behind me, maybe, just maybe, a lesson had finally been learned. Or, at the very least, a memory had been burned into her mind, one she wouldn't forget, not anytime soon. The automatic doors slid shut behind me with a soft hiss, sealing off the deli section and all the noise that came with it. But even outside, with the cooler air brushing against my face and the parking lot stretching out in front of me, I could still hear her voice echoing in my head. Not the words themselves, just the tone, that shrill, fractured sound of someone who had finally run into a boundary they couldn't shove aside. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting my grip on the warm paper bags, letting my breathing even out. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. If anything, I felt strangely grounded, like my feet were finally planted firmly on the earth after watching someone else stomp around as if they owned it. As I walked across the parking lot, the scene replayed itself in my mind, not as a victory lap, but as a slow, almost clinical review. I thought about how close I'd come to doing nothing. About how easy it would have been to stay silent, to let her cut in, to go home mildly annoyed but ultimately unchanged. That's usually how these moments end, after all. Entitled people win because everyone else is tired of conflict, tired of being the difficult one, tired of making a scene. And for years, I had been one of those people, the kind who swallowed irritation and called it maturity. But standing there with those bags in my hands, I realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, maybe, but enough. I loaded the groceries into my car, the smell of the wedges filling the small space as soon as I set them down. I closed the trunk and leaned against it for a second, staring up at the gray sky, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest, not the loud, flashy kind you see in movies. This was softer, heavier, the kind that comes from knowing you didn't lower yourself to someone else's level, you simply refused to step aside for them. The drive home felt shorter than usual. Traffic lights changed quickly. The radio murmured in the background. But I wasn't really listening. My thoughts kept drifting back to the girl who'd been standing next to that woman. The way she'd flinched when the shouting started, the way she'd avoided eye contact. Like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I wondered what she'd say on the drive home, if she'd stay quiet, if she'd apologize for something that wasn't her fault, or if she'd just stare out the window, counting the minutes until she could be alone again. That thought lingered with me longer than the satisfaction did. When I finally got home, my wife looked up from the couch as I walked in. "You're back already," she said, smiling. "Did you get them?" I held up the bags, still warm, and she laughed. "That's a lot of wedges," she said. "You have no idea," I replied. As we sat down to eat, she noticed the look on my face, not upset, not excited, just thoughtful. She asked what happened, and I told her, not in a rush, not with exaggeration. I walked her through it slowly, from the line to the waiting to the moment the deli worker asked how much I wanted. When I got to the part where I said I took all of them, she froze, wedge halfway to her mouth. "You didn't," she said. "I did," I confirmed. And then I told her about the scream. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from disbelief, mixed with admiration. "That's incredible," she said. I wish I could have seen her face. "So do I admitted. But honestly, I think I'll remember it just fine. As we ate, I realized something else. The wedges tasted better than usual. Not because they were cooked differently. Not because they were fresher, but because they came with context, with a story, with the quiet knowledge that sometimes doing nothing is a choice, and sometimes choosing not to step aside is an act of self-respect. Later that night, as the house settled into silence and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind wandered again. Not to her anger, but to the moment just before it. The moment when she still believed she was going to win. That confidence, that unearned certainty, fascinated me. Because it wasn't based on logic or fairness or even experience. Was based on habit, on a lifetime of pushing just hard enough to get what she wanted. And for the first time, that habit had failed her. I wondered how she'd tell the story later. Would she paint herself as the victim? Would she leave out the parts where she cut the line? Where she ignored the rules, where she treated everyone else like they didn't matter? Probably. People like her rarely see themselves clearly. They rewrite reality until it fits the version of themselves they can live with. But somewhere in that retelling, there would be a gap. A moment that didn't make sense. A point where her usual tricks stopped working. And that gap would bother her. Days passed, then weeks. The memory didn't fade the way most small conflicts do. It stayed with me, not as a source of pride, but as a reminder. A reminder that patience doesn't mean passivity, that politeness doesn't require self-erasure, and that sometimes the most effective response isn't confrontation, it's consistency. Following the rules so thoroughly that the person trying to break them has nowhere left to stand. I caught myself noticing these moments more after that, at coffee shops, at intersections, in meetings, the subtle ways people test boundaries, expecting others to bend. And each time, I felt a little steadier, a little less inclined to disappear. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't start seeking out petty victories. But I stopped apologizing for existing in shared spaces, and every once in a while, when I'm standing in a line and someone sighs loudly behind me or edges a little too close to the front, I think of that deli, of the warm paper bags in my hands, of that scream echoing off tiled walls, and I wait. Because I know something now that I didn't before. Waiting isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's strategy. What surprised me most in the days that followed wasn't how often I thought about her. It was how often I thought about myself, about the version of me that would have handled that situation differently just a year earlier. The version that would have stepped back, sighed internally, and told herself it wasn't worth it. That version would have gone home with a smaller bag of wedges and a familiar, sour feeling sitting quietly in her chest, the feeling of having been dismissed, overlooked, quietly disrespected in a way that was small enough to be ignored but sharp enough to sting. That night, lying in bed beside my wife, I realized how used I'd become to swallowing moments like that. Not because I was weak, but because I'd been taught, like so many of us, that keeping the peace was more important than keeping your place. That speaking up was rude, that holding your ground was somehow aggressive, and it struck me how often that lesson benefits the loudest, most entitled people in the room, while everyone else is expected to make themselves smaller for the sake of comfort. The memory of the woman's face came back to me in flashes, not the anger, but the confusion. That moment when the rules didn't bend, when no one rushed to fix things for her. When her usual tactics failed so completely that all she could do was scream a question she didn't want answered. He did what? As if reality itself had malfunctioned. As if the universe had suddenly stopped cooperating with her expectations. I wondered how she explained it later, if she stormed out of the store still muttering under her breath. If she complained to someone at customer service, demanding to know how such a thing could be allowed to happen to her. If she told friends or family the story with key details conveniently missing. Maybe in her version, she was polite. Maybe the line didn't exist. Maybe I was framed as cruel or selfish or unreasonable. That's often how these stories go when people can't accept accountability. They edit themselves into the victim. But no matter how she told it, there was one detail she couldn't erase. She didn't get what she wanted, and for someone like her, that kind of ending sticks. It itches, it lingers, it resurfaces at inconvenient moments. Because it contradicts the narrative she's used to living inside, The one where persistence always pays off and rules are flexible as long as you push hard enough. I found myself thinking again about the girl who'd been standing next to her, the quiet one, the one who hadn't said a word. I hoped, maybe foolishly, that she'd seen something different that day, that she'd noticed how calmly it all unfolded, how no one yelled back, how fairness didn't require cruelty. Maybe she'd tucked that moment away somewhere deep inside, as proof that the world doesn't always reward the loudest voice, that sometimes respect is enforced not through dominance, but through patience. As time passed, the story became something my wife and I would occasionally laugh about, not in a mocking way, but in that shared, knowing way people do when they've witnessed something rare, something quietly satisfying. Every time we bought potato wedges after that, one of us would inevitably smile and say, "Best $14 you ever spent," and we'd both know exactly what it meant. It became shorthand for a moment of self-respect, a reminder that you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. But beyond the humor, something deeper had shifted. I noticed it in how I moved through the world afterward. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't start seeking out moments of petty justice. But I stopped preemptively shrinking. I stopped assuming that my presence was an inconvenience. When I stood in lines, I stood firmly. When someone edged too close or tested a boundary, I met it calmly instead of instinctively stepping aside. And most of the time, that was enough. It's strange how a moment so small can recalibrate something so fundamental. How standing your ground once can echo into 100 other situations, at work, in conversations, in spaces where you'd once stayed silent just to avoid discomfort. That day in the deli didn't make me braver, it made me clearer about what I deserved, clearer about the difference between kindness and compliance. I also thought about the deli worker, about the way he'd smiled, just barely, when he understood what I was doing. About how he hadn't needed to say a word. People like him see this kind of behavior every day. They absorb it, deflect it, endure it, and in that moment, I like to think that following the rules so precisely felt like a small victory for him too, a reminder that fairness still matters. Even in the smallest exchanges, every once in a while, I imagine running into her again. In another store, another line, another ordinary place. I wonder if she'd recognize me, if she'd stiffen just a little, remembering the one time the universe didn't bend. Or if she'd already filed it away as an anomaly, a fluke, something that happened to her rather than something caused by her. I'll probably never know, and honestly, I don't need to, because the real takeaway was never about her. It was about the realization that justice doesn't always come in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in paper, smelling faintly of salt and oil. Sometimes it's as simple as not stepping aside when you're supposed to be next. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing more than take exactly what's offered to you, no more, no less, and walk away without apology. And if you're listening to this thinking about a moment when you stayed quiet, when you let someone else take your place just to keep things smooth, I hope you remember this story. Not as encouragement to be petty, but as permission to be present, to take up space, to trust that fairness is worth protecting, even when it feels small, because sometimes, the smallest acts of self-respect leave the loudest echoes. And sometimes, the best revenge really does cost $14.